And it appears most of the time for most people that there is a self here somewhere. There's a separate identity that is apart from, at a distance, at a remove from an exterior world, which is, stable relatively, and independent of the act of perception. This is wrong. This is false.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Wystan Bryant-Scott. Wystan is a Buddhist meditation teacher who spent roughly 2.5 years of his life practicing in an intensive residential monastic setting. He studied under teachers in multiple Buddhist traditions, including Theravada, Vajrayana, Zen, and Dzogchen, and is a certified teacher of previous podcast guest Shinzen Young's unified mindfulness system. Wystan is also on the board of advisors of the Qualia Research Institute. Today, we discuss Buddhism, meditation, awakening, and coming out of suffering. Hope you enjoy the conversation. For you, in your own experience, the what is it that the term awakening signifies, right? Because I think I saw something you wrote, which I liked, which was about the idea of kind of lucidity, and you mentioned the word lucidity already, might be more apt than the idea of waking up from the dream, is rather that you kind of become awake within the dream. So this is the kind of thing I'm interested in, is like, what's the, if you were to use the term awakening, like, why is that relevant? Like, what is it it's pointing to in the dynamic of the individual going on this journey?
Yeah. So we have these senses: seeing, hearing, feeling. That's Shinzen Young's formulation, which is an adaptation of the 5 skandha model from Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. And it appears most of the time for most people that there is a self here somewhere. There's a separate identity that is apart from, at a distance, at a remove from an exterior world, which is, stable relatively, and independent of the act of perception. This is wrong. This is false. And you can reason your way into that, right? And there's excellent reams of, Buddhist scholasticism, which, in my opinion, there's some great knockdown arguments in there. But in terms of actual and this misperception, because it is just a misperception, is at the root of all existential distress. I want to say, not all distress, but in terms of perceiving and inhabiting your body and mind.
Right.
That's poor phrasing. That's dualistic phrasing. It's all. But as a suffering separate entity in a solid world of fixated form, it's rough. And seeing through that relieves the bulk of suffering in a human life.
Right. And I feel like, from what I've heard of you telling your story on other interviews, it feels like your story is an example of like Buddhism doing what it says on the tin, really, where it's like, there's this religion that's about, salvation on an individual level from suffering, and it's got these teachings, and it sounds like you were suffering a lot and you followed that path, and it worked.
Yeah, no, I was suicidally depressed for about 7 years in adolescence, between the ages of 11 and 18. Got the diagnoses and was medicated to hell and back. And during that time, I was pretty obsessed with the human predicament, my own and everyone else's, in an unhealthy way. Just in terms of my own personal well-being. And I came across Buddhism and was like, wow, I find almost nothing in here to disagree with except the mythological and cosmological elements. Which was the first time that I'd ever encountered a system of thought where I was like, wow, I actually don't disagree with any of this. Which was, so that was my way in, reading at first, and then having a few encounters with more seasoned practitioners. I met some monastics early on, when I was a teenager, I think, just some interfaith stuff. I grew up Christian. Yeah, I'm not sure where you want me to go from here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the way I said it then made it sound like you just kind of took up meditation and just smoothly went down the the road. Like, I
No.
guess, yeah. What's the story of that path?
Sure. So I dropped out of university thinking that I was going to become a monk full time, and do that for the rest of my life. I was dead set, convinced of it, that was the right thing for me to do. And that was as a result of, very thorough conviction, on an intellectual level, and then several spontaneous, I mean, there were factors, obviously, but experiences of insight prior to or accompanying early meditation practice, which were like, whoa, okay, this is undeniable.
In your case, was there a kind of did you follow maps in particular traditions and
Yeah.
hit the kind of the
Yep.
benchmarks when you were supposed to, and that kind of.
Yeah, pretty much. Um, I mean, it's the maps and models, right? Of course, are fallible and not applicable to everyone at all times. But it turns out, if you take up the practices as they are recommended to be taken up within the contexts and conditions in which they were designed with appropriate guidance, yeah, things pretty much unfold how it's described in old texts. um, and so at the beginning of my practice, I was casting about actually for which like lineage or order to ordain with, and mostly dissatisfied for the kind of rigor and intensity of practice that I was really looking for, which I've since found. But so casting about, mostly disappointed, and I took up, because in terms of actual practice instructions, they were the most, readily accessible and applicable. I took up, pretty standard mainline Theravada, meditation techniques. So shamatha vipassana, stabilizing the mind on a single object for long durations, and entering into progressive states of absorption in which ordinary perception diminishes or ceases altogether. And then on the basis of that absorption, engaging in vipassana, primarily with a focus on impermanence as one of the tilakkhana, the three characteristics which characterize all phenomenal existence: impermanence, suffering, and not self.
Right. And then
And impermanence is seen as a doorway into recognizing those other two. So if you see impermanence thoroughly, those other three, I mean, it's all of a piece.
Right.
If you actually see impermanence thoroughly, the other two come along.
Right. Yeah. So to give people a feel of this, if they're not Vipassana practitioners, yeah, you're looking at phenomena and then you're seeing that there's no solid thing there to fixate on. It's just this flow of appearances.
People must often begin with the body.
Right. And then there's the seeing that they're empty in the sense that in this flow, there can't actually be a solid thing there. And then the game of seeking, craving, which causes suffering, of looking in those appearances for some permanent satisfaction. It's that game is seen, and there's the kind of, like this is silly and futile, and so I'll just stop doing that. So by seeing
and that happens, on a conceptual level at first, right? And then through more and continued and sustained practice over years and decades, that just is and there can be watershed moments, of course, and there were for me, but that gets worn down. Basically, that habit, deeply rooted habit of taking appearances at face value.
Yeah. The so I wasn't, because of my path was one of kind of like a kind of discovering the already fully awake nature.
I should say my practice got there actually, but through Theravadan methods.
Yeah, so that's what I'm interested in is because I popped out. The way I often think about it is like the mind is like this kind of structure that's constructed, and with meditation, you're perhaps moving slowly down until you can drop off the edge into kind of your true nature, away from the constructions. Whereas with me, it was like I was so running away in the other direction, I fell off popped out the other end and kind of fell off the back of the structure. And of course, you end up in your true nature. So there's a big difference between doing that through a discernment skill, all that kind of stuff through meditation, and doing it through neurotic, fixated rumination, which is what I did.
I had plenty of that, so you're not alone.
Yeah. But yeah, so now we're talking about the direct path and the gradual path, and it's not surprising that they should both be routes to what is, because again, once you see what is the illusion, the fixated ideas, that whole dream seems so. It's the miracle isn't awakening, I guess. The miracle is falling asleep. Like the miracle is like how do we stay so like fixated in this little drama? Yeah, well, and yeah, lots of conditioning.
Yeah.
So it shouldn't be surprising that you can get to it through loads of different means. But yeah, it's interesting to me that by tuning into what it experience, I mean, because what is always staring us in the face, right? So it's like if
Yeah, no, I mean
if you
your own face has never been concealed from you.
right,
And
right,
they use this language in Zen and in Dzogchen, actually, interestingly. And as far as I know, there's no historical connection between these two usages. But your original face before your parents were born, right? That's often
right,
an
right,
initial koan given by Zen teachers. Show me your face before your parents were born,
yeah,
and then the separate self has to grapple with that and then come to resolution.
yeah,
And then in Dzogchen, the phrase exposing nakedly the face of Rigpa, Rigpa being Tibetan translation of Vidya, which means is a general term for knowledge, but in this context means knowledge of one's own state, which is awake.
right. And then when the path led to this for you, was there a shift, like a nonlinear shifting into a different state,
Yeah,
as opposed
multiple.
to a gradual softening?
Yeah, I mean gradual softening with pronounced drop-offs.
Right. When I so yeah, but
Bumpy ride.
that's what I was. Yeah, so that's what I'm interested in getting to the bumps because with the kind of initial awakening, there's a sense of I see why a diamond is often an analogy, right? And these things where like you touch one surface of awakening and it feels like you're touching the entire diamond because you are, but you've actually only touched one surface. There's still more work to be done. So but because of that, I remember early on feeling like there's a sense of completion. Like there's no point in looking at maps. Like I've done it. I've touched even before I knew what it was that I'd done. And then when I ended up kind of just suddenly going into what's often called the dark night of the soul, or I found that in casting around for kind of maps at that point, because that's when you really want to, you're in this tunnel of suffering and you really want to get out. So it's good to get some maps. But I think it was in the progressive insight model, it's referred to as the knowledge of suffering.
Dukkha-jnanas. Yep.
Right. So that felt really apt because dark night of the soul is a kind of poetic, thing. Whereas
it's a borrowed term from the Christian mystical tradition. I wish it hadn't been imported into our contemporary lexicon in the way it has, but here we are.
Yeah. But so I guess I'm advocating for use of the knowledge of suffering because what it felt like, was that it's like if you want to resolve all of these habitual tendencies of resistance to just dropping into the present moment, then you're going to have to go into it. You're going to have to feel it. You're going to have to learn to not struggle with it and resist it and repress it.
There's no way around it.
Yeah.
Like, especially if what you're after is not just a glimpse or the ability to glimpse repeatedly, but actually abide stably and function as that.
Exactly right. So we're talking here of pushing through to a point where you're like, there's the longing to abide. And I guess I say longing because desire is an interesting word because I think at this point a lot of people get very fed up with the process, and from the thoughts, the egoic standpoint, like it can feel just like not great. But then there's the reason I think one pushes through is because there's this longing for just to get out of suffering, to like really resolve
freedom.
Right. And when I think this also is where I came across the Vipassana jhanas as well as like a part of this, at least connected with this kind of maps. And so was this in the tradition you're working in, were you aware that this was on the horizon when you were working with these kinds of maps?
I mean, and knowledge of the map, foreknowledge of the maps and what was likely to arise, or what could possibly arise when nasty shit did arise. I was like, oh, no big surprise. Okay,
so
carry on.
You got to see like, okay, 2 steps from now I'm going to be in misery and then disgust and like all of those stages.
So when my body started to completely dissolve into like vibrating,
right.
Or I had intense like tremors or all kinds of odd shit. I was like, oh, okay, this is expected. No problem.
Yeah.
Carry on.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I guess before one enters this train, it seems kind of weird how good some of the maps are. Again, no map is perfect. Some maps, will work for some people, some others. But I think with these kinds of maps, at least I found, I mean, it wasn't this kind of linear progression, but I found these maps tend to capture really aspects that everyone seems to go through. And I guess it shouldn't be surprising that at this point, we're talking about a very visceral, physiological, embodied process. And so if you're letting go in certain ways, I think disgust being on the map, I think if you're letting go at the level of kind of your digestive system and these really primal, disgust is one of the kind of earliest emotions, right? In terms of like, oh, there's something in my body I want to reject, or so I think it makes sense if you want to. I doubt there are people walking around who just don't have that physiology. You wouldn't survive very long probably if you didn't have the ability to vomit if there was something poisonous, right, in something you ate. So I guess once you kind of go through it, kind of seems obvious that that these maps should correlate. But before you do, I guess it all seems like some kind of it's all happening internally, right? So you only have other people's testament to go on, and it seems like some kind of I guess you have no way to assess it until you walk the path yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you can reliable testimony and inference.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the best you can do. But no, I mean that the classical maps, every one that I have worked with and looked at, they're again, apart from psychic powers, cosmological elements which don't fit with the naturalist worldview that most of us come into practice with. Though plenty visionary experiences can and do arise for contemporary practitioners. A recent book I had on my podcast came out from D. Osto, an academic looking at really profound, mystical, revelatory, visionary experiences. They happen pretty reliably for a certain percentage of the population if they engage these practices intensively, right?
Yeah.
And then, anyway.
Yeah, I mean, and I also I found the Theta model to be quite useful as well. It's not something I've heard you speak about, but the kind of in Theravada tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really practicing within Theravada anymore, so I don't reference it often. But yeah.
Are you practicing more in kind of Vajrayana and Tibetan stuff?
Yeah, so my current commitment is within Dzogchen primarily, and working with a teacher within that, Lama Justin von Boydash, whom you may know. And then I'm also kind of looking to concurrently continue training in Zen. So I have not yet formally committed to Medo Mori Roshi, but that's
right.
No.
It makes sense to me. You'll be using those practices for where you're at, I guess, in the kind of deep stage stuff. Like, do you find that this is kind of does it still feel like practices, or does it feel like practices kind of spontaneously practicing when you take up these things?
It feels like the latter.
Yeah, that's what I would have suspected.
Yeah. Yeah, in a sense, teachers and practitioners are rightly cautious of discussing advanced territory because it's mostly not useful.
Yeah, I won't push you then.
Feel free to. Feel free to push.
I didn't have a question anyway. So
there are certain like techniques and practices within Dzogchen, for example, which are classically held restricted and secret, which I'm not going to talk about. And likewise, within Zen, the kind of the what happens within the interview room between a Zen teacher and a student is it's not considered oh no, you must never speak or you'll go to hell. But again, it's within those traditions, Dzogchen, Mahamudra, Zen. Those are the traditions that I'm sort of familiar with. Within that kind of direct, non-dual approach, it's intimate, it's one-on-one, it's personal, and the practices that are handed, there's a real care within those lineage traditions of maintaining the fidelity of the transmission in terms of all of its aspects, and then a constant refinement and challenge from the teacher to the student.
When I was, I guess when I was in my 20s, I had a kind of sense of, I guess, a lack of understanding and maybe even an insensitivity and a lack of sympathy around why these things were kept private and why there was that structure. Now I'm the complete opposite, and I basically think that I have a sense that the Dzogchen teachings and
it's not like, if you want to, you can buy all of this stuff on Amazon and read the most esoteric secret material. It's like, it's available. And I did read all of that. And again, it wasn't very useful. So,
right. But so I think, I used to think, I guess it's a kind of like perhaps like a Western secular appropriative thing of just like a universalist thing of like knowledge is knowledge, especially knowledge of your true nature. If there are good pointers, everyone should have access to this, and just a very simple worldview. And then I guess I've come to see, we spoke before about how my own kind of the descriptions of Rigpa really described the state that the non-state that I was inhabiting with the initial awakening, and so when I read it, I was like, yeah, this is great. People should have access to this. And then as I discovered in myself the way that I was bypassing very aggressively, and then saw in others the same thing, I'm like, okay, actually introducing this en masse, there's a reason people check that people have their ethics straight and they have their right concentration, right mindfulness, all that straight before they're given this stuff. Because otherwise, I think it's, I don't know if there's a term for this, but it's something like, maybe like post-awakening syndrome would be a good description for it, where like you get this egoic rebound of like, where there's
often
some
very
opening,
strong.
yeah, and then there's some like really aggressive fixating in the rational mind, and some it could take
Or
different forms, but it's
claiming of the attainment, claiming of the
right.
state, claiming of the experience. Whoa, this
Yeah,
happened to me.
yeah, and now it's mine. Yeah, so like that whole thing, I think those, if you're given mainly those teachings, you're begging for people to armor themselves in that, like, I've got it, like the thing I said before, you've touched the diamond, but you've touched one surface of it, and then you think you're done, and you're going to armor yourself in that.
And all the great masters of the past have said again and again and again and again that an initial glimpse is just that.
Right.
And that glimpse may stabilize. Great, that happens sometimes. And even if it stabilizes completely, that's great, cool. And then what about how you live your life, all of your relations, what you do in the world?
Yeah. Do you have I guess, how do you approach that engagement with the relative? Does it just kind of come instinctively and naturally, or do you have a more, some people have kind of like a soul making dharma, like where they take it more, I guess, formalized in some way? Yeah. How do you approach the relative?
Work in progress.
Yeah.
The general movement is towards spontaneity, no structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And yet I still practice, structured things. And I think reason, what should I do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess for me, it feels like with the deepening into the absolute, it's like the momentum of the narrative of life that drives you forward through your own personal attachments and that whole agenda, that comes to a kind of screeching stop. And then suddenly there are different interpretations that can arise from that standing start. And then there's the kind of like, to me, it feels quite instinctive and obvious where I'm like, okay, well, that's the one that's aligned with compassion and relieving suffering and showing up in the world in a responsible way. And so I'll do that one. And so it's like, I guess that it says, I guess I'd be interested in, sometimes people have asked about this, and I don't have like a formal, like, way to do that, apart from what I just described of like, I guess being really authentic with yourself and really being honest with yourself and letting the movement arise from a phrase is coming, I think it's from some Christian traditions where they talk about being spirit led. It's like being led by the absolute instead of being led by the contracted self. So, and
and that, as the maturation. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, being led by compassion. Yeah. Do you find that when you work with people, are people's motivations typically like relieving suffering, or do people come with like a desire to understand their minds more?
All
like
kinds of motivations.
Truth, yeah.
And the first thing that I ask people usually is, why are we talking? What do you want? How can I help? let's be clear.
Right.
Why are you interested in practice? There's this popular, unfortunately popular in my opinion, view that having goals or having a certain aim in mind is, that's antithetical to
right.
Not it's just, come on. I think that's a really immature view, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think my initial feeling is that with the gradual path, you see plenty of people who become lifelong meditators who kind of, are in the shallow ends. But then I find it rarer to find people like you who really go kind of are very thorough with it. And I wonder if that's the kind of the causes and conditions that lead to that really was the deep, authentic desire to relieve suffering, like the extent of the suffering. If that's
my own and others, and also a kind of allergy, like to to falsity in myself and others. It's in some ways it's a weakness because I am quite reactive because of it. Have been, still am to some extent. Less less than I was. Yeah.
It's interesting because
so it's a kind of overriding cognitive, emotional, social need for truth, whatever that is, and then combined with just like a desperate desire to relieve my own suffering, and then do something to help other people.
That's a very similar to me. I think that there are these factors that basically you could say determine like where people end up on this path. Like I suspect if my life had been fairly cushy and there was that everyday dukkha of like not quite getting satisfied, like I doubt I would have pushed through down to this.
Oh, I wouldn't probably.
Yeah. And I think that's why people talk about suffering being grace as well. Like, it kind of forces you to wake up, because instead of dealing with the kind of the low level suffering. But it's interesting what you said, the allergy, what was the word you used? To falsity, or an
allergy to falsity. Like from a very early age, I've had a just intense disgust response to any deception or imprecision, or again, I think I'm neurodivergent. I was assessed as a teenager. And while I don't meet clinical criteria for some diagnostics, for a diagnosis, it's not normal up here. by statistical measures.
I was sitting with this recently with myself, and I realized very recently something very similar, which is, I think the thing that's driven me on the path is a phobia to bullshit, is probably the best way to say it, because there's a certain kind of falsity that's like, where it's like the treadmill thing of seeking, where it's like, so I had early experience in life with someone who's a narcissist, and I think that laid this foundations of like, whatever this is, this game of like, that's not going anywhere apart from keeping me in relation and stressing me out. And there's clearly no endpoint of fulfillment or authenticity and connect. It's just like whatever that is, no. And so I'm going the opposite.
In myself, elsewhere.
Right. And seeing it myself.
This is just not good.
When I would see it myself, exactly, setting boundaries internally and just being like, no, I'm not doing that to myself. It's a draining, it's bullshit's the best word I can think of, because it just has that connotation of something that, nonsense really as well. But and then coupled with the suffering that goes along with that. So it makes sense that narcissism and no self are perhaps kind of two extremes here in terms of like
and people who have a no self experience.
Yeah,
people who have a no self experience will often be kind of narcissistic for a while afterwards.
Right, that's the post awakening rebound we spoke about, right? Yeah. Concentration is something, I guess I'm interested in meditation purely because it's a way of orienting to experience. And for me, my path hasn't really been one of hours and hours and hours of formal practice, but rather a kind of constant, it feels like all of my life plays out in practice, where I'm just constantly interrogating experience. And so concentration, I wonder if doing that naturally has given me some kind of concentration without intentionally doing that. But at the same time, I do think I'm probably, actually I'm certain of it, that you probably have a vastly more laser-like concentration than I do, because of the practice. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on the importance of concentration on the path.
Well, very, very, unequivocal. If not for recognition, then for post-recognition stabilization and integration.
Because I guess in my, what I've been, I come from this very non-gradual, non-dual perspective, and what I've always noticed is the more I deconstruct reactivity, say like doing emotion work and stuff like that, the effortlessness of concentration is just there in awareness, in the way that the phenomena are just given effortlessly. I don't have to do it, right? So for me, concentration isn't so much an extra thing. Well, I do think there's a component of like training brain networks to just reorient. That's one part of it. But generally, I don't think it, like, my instinct is the idea of building up this really strong machine of attention in your frontal lobes that can really, like, focus and everything isn't
Drill,
really
focus, stabilize, and actually drill into a phenomenon.
right.
Yeah,
But I guess my experience is I'm sure a bit of that comes along more than just, the average distracted monkey mind, because you are always, because, in my case, I'm always oriented to experience, but without it, everything seems to, I seem to end up in the same place without really the word. I could talk about my entire path without really using the word concentration, is my point.
sure.
And and I guess that I'm interested in that because other people will. I mean, I think a recent video you had up a few of your books about different maps, and I think one of them was called Right Concentration. I think that's what planted the
Yeah,
seed in my mind, was
good
that,
book.
like, right, so we're talking about the same thing, and if I can talk about this without talking about concentration once, but there's almost an entire book called Right Concentration because that's one of the what is it, the
Eightfold Path. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
eightfold path. That's it. Yeah, I guess it might be another, and we might be also be describing the way that these different approaches end up at the same terrain, where what is just is effortlessly, and you can come to that through a very kind of rigorous analytical dissecting in experience, or you can come to it perhaps through a very deep surrender and letting go. But
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
everything is, it's that total exertion of existence where it's already doing it. So
Yeah.
you don't need to attain some extra skill. It can be useful to approach it, but I guess I'm saying I suspect there are other ways to approach it.
Yeah. 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 And this is actually, again, one more reason that I cranky that people don't pay attention to classical texts and traditions. This is all classified actually within the Theravada tradition, for instance. Um, there are those liberated by insight alone who don't develop the jhanas, which is what right concentration in the early tradition
Hmm.
is defined as. The first four jhanas and the four formless variants of the fourth is one way of classifying those states. There are those liberated through insight alone, and they don't develop those, and they can afterwards if they want to. And the Buddha encouraged people to do so because it's just like having a good exercise routine. It's,
Right.
I mean, sure, why not? And there's a temporary conditional kind of liberation that comes with concentration, right? Entering into incredibly profound states of stillness, um, absorption, spaciousness, formlessness, and kind of marinating your being in that for long durations makes real pronounced changes on perception, but also on behavior, affect, cognition, etc.
Right.
So there's those benefits. And then there are those who are liberated, through both. They develop concentration first, and then insight happens. Yeah. The
You
truth is,
mentioned
most
earlier,
people are a mix.
right?
These
Do you
are
find
idealized
people
types.
when people are practicing this kind of gradual path, do you find people have these sudden shifts then as you're like teaching them? Do they come to you one week and they say they've just woken up suddenly in the intervening week?
That hasn't happened yet.
Is it more of like a kind of gradual, they're kind of becoming familiar with the three characteristics and deepening into it, that kind of.
Well, also, I'm speaking here not so much about how I teach varies a lot depending on the person, right? And my formal teacher certification comes through Shinzen Young, and his kind of secular adaptation of these, like the rich contemplative heritage of humanity, but primarily Buddhism. That's what he knows best, and is also what I know best. So it's in that secular framing with some different language and terms. And I can speak about that if you want. And I'm in this weird place pedagogically where people come to me with this this kind of melange of views and ideas and concepts that they've accumulated from who knows where, the internet mostly, or books. And so I'll use Buddhist terminology if people are familiar with that, or I think it's useful to drop one of those terms in. Or I'll use Shinzen's language, but it's all just perception.
Yeah.
Labels for different different perceptions and methods.
You mentioned the kind of secular aspect to it, and also you're talking about kind of having a naturalistic worldview, which is something I'm very kind of big on as someone with a background as a scientist. it also fits with the revulsion to bullshit, I guess, and deception, where that can come with kind of abuses in religion around dogma and just supernatural claims that are unjust, without justification. But yeah, I guess I'm interested in how is that married with the parts of the Buddhist, teachings that you initially were phobic to when you first came across it, the more
Sure.
supernatural stuff.
Yeah. So there's experience and then there's reflection on experience, which is also just experience. But if if you I was initially allergic to kind of the rites, rituals, and devotional aspects of the religion, as I was entering it. Um, Now I appreciate them very much. um,
When it comes to belief in the ontological status of deities and stuff like that, like
sure.
the
Yeah.
supernatural things, I can imagine that doesn't come up much during practice. Like maybe it's just not a non-issue for someone with like a naturalistic worldview.
No. Yeah. I mean, it's not. It has never really been an issue for. I mean, but there's been clash, right? Where I have an experience which is intense, overpowering, and total, and within that experience, there is no reflection on the ontological status of it,
Right,
right?
right.
Um, there's no room for that.
I was quite surprised when that started happening to me when I would have more quirky experiences and there was just zero curiosity about like in a moment of very deep surrender that led to really kind of altered experience. There was a kind of hearing of like two voices having a conversation about me, which would have been very normal to interpret it as like angels or something. Like
Sure.
it really felt like some beings were like, "Oh, James is doing this now. Like, should we intervene?" Or like, and I'm just like,
Yeah.
"Oh,"
Yeah.
like it didn't, And I guess, if I were to comment on it, I would then say, well, I think that's totally the kind of thing the brain could do. And like, when you dream or whatever, but like I had zero inkling to do that. It was just a weird experience. I was just like, okay, whatever. And I just kind of got on with my day. And I guess metaphysical anxieties around, yeah, the ontological status of things. Perhaps those attachments can also just fall away when you're deep
Yeah.
in this.
Basically, if that doesn't happen, more work to do.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because I
um,
feel like if when I die now, it turns out that like I don't know, the Methodists are just they got it perfectly right, and whatever they believe is the thing, and I have to learn about Methodism. I feel a lightness around like okay, fine, like I'll just do that. Whereas when I was a teenager, that would have been like, wait, no, what? Okay, I need to get ahead of this now. like um,
yeah.
uh,
So there is a kind of ontological shock that most people undergo at a certain
right,
point, sooner or later, right? Where their usual understanding of the world and themselves in some way is just fundamentally challenged or broken or shattered.
yeah,
And that happens again and again, right? Um, and eventually you, on a subconscious embodied level, just stop doing that. You stop fixating.
right.
So,
You learn the lesson.
yeah. And I should say it's probably obvious, but there's no loss of functionality here, right? I mean, there if there is, then that's a pathology. That's not that's not the proper course of practice.
Right. I think so yeah, with did you find it was useful to kind of combine practice with other techniques like so things like for me I found body-based work like and like psychotherapy and all those techniques were very helpful in dealing with kind of attachments, emotional content, or have you really focused on the meditation side of things?
Meditation side of things, pretty overridingly, and actually to my detriment.
But do you find it kind
um,
of unravels those things in a way it's
yeah.
like a all-purpose cleaner that just kind of works through the
Yeah,
system?
no, I do sincerely believe that within, like, if you live in a monastery, for example, and you have constant communal feedback, and you're practicing with the guidance of a, real teacher, you don't need psychotherapy. Uh, but for the vast majority of us, myself included, we're not doing that full time, even if
Yeah,
maybe we sometimes go and do that. Um, and relating relating on that more conventional level to your own psychology beliefs, motivations, psychological structures within yourself, and then it's very it's kind of hard to get along in the world or have conversations with some people if you don't have that um, structure to converse over.
Right.
And I wanted to nuance something I said before, that if there's no loss of functionality, there can be in fact temporary losses of functionality. For example, this is a common example within the Rinzai Zen tradition, which is known for koan work. In the traditional form, you're taking that up intensively 24/7 until it's done, and you're doing that in a residential setting, and that's really intense practice. And in the immediate kind of blowout that kind of practice can precipitate a really dramatic shattering kind of awakening, there can actually be leading up to it and in the immediate aftermath a loss of functionality, and that is understood and managed carefully with compassion within that institutional structure. That was the nuance I wanted to add. In the long term, there's no loss of functionality.
We can't guarantee. We can't make that promise that like no one's going to lose have variations in functionality as they explore their inner world.
No, I mean, meditation is not safe. It's not, the risk profile is not the same as dropping 500 mics of acid for most people, most of the time. And yet, the kind of intensity and extremity of experience that can result from sometimes not even that much practice, where there's a vast neurodiversity in the human population. Some people engage in these practices and low doses and boom. It's a similar risk profile at the deep end to, heavy psychedelic use.
I think it's interesting to me that I feel like one can't really consent to waking up before, because you don't really know what you're getting yourself in for. It's like I feel like I understand why in Buddhism they talk about like stream entry, because it feels like there's this dynamic of like aligning with opening to reality that is being practiced in monasteries and that just exists in the currents of society in these spaces. And our conversation is a little ripple of that now, and people listening are tapping into that current, and you can either go along with that experiential opening that's deeper than your beliefs, your agendas, the ego that would consent. It's kind of that can get submerged into this current that in a way where, the ego can't really, or the sense of self can't really step back and get its idea. It can't box in the awakening with its ideas in a way that would allow it to know it and then say, oh yes, I'll adopt, I'll have that, especially since most of it's its own undoing. So it's unlike anything else.
There's no informed consent for enlightenment, as Shinzen says.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm getting. I didn't realize he'd said that, but that's exactly. You can't be informed. It's like people talk about unknowing. It's like it's like a state of being uninformed. It's like letting your ideas and your interpretations fall away. And so how could you possibly be informed advance about that state of being uninformed?
And then noticing the tendency to reconstruct, right? And seeing that building and letting that go.
Yeah. I think my impression is a vigilance to that is always required. Like I suspect, that views the habit or the possibility that some view will arise and then try and fixate. I've not really heard anyone claim that fully stops at any point, and there's just like I'm done now. People talk about being done with practice.
And people claim that.
But
some people do claim that.
The people I've heard who claim to be like done also say, but there's an ongoing deepening in which there's always this kind of, I guess that vigilance to fixation in views. But maybe I've not heard those people.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can say that I've never met anyone who is done.
Yeah.
There is no done. This is a human process within a vastly complex, interconnected web of causes and conditions. What the fuck does done mean?
Yeah. I think there. It's interesting because I think from other. It depends on. It very much depends on what you're done with, right? So, like, if someone, when we were talking before about the idea of practicing, if someone could kind of switch into your phenomenal experience, they might go like, oh, you're done from my perspective of what I'm aiming for in terms of like, that the uncertainty around the, as you said, the kind of existential distress and like all that, they might go, oh no, you're done from what I would consider, so there can be these thresholds that you cross in terms of shifts. And you mentioned, I think it's on your website, you describe yourself as a liberation focused coach. And is that like
Yeah, as Shinzen just yeah, yeah. Mhm. I mean, I'm happy to work with anyone for any reason. Well, I mean, related to meditation, and what I can provide in terms of what I know and what I can teach. But that is my motivation for doing it. Um,
yeah, but I think liberation can be spoken about as a gradual lightening, a gradual kind of, the
mhm.
suffering gets lighter and lighter, and there's more and more unboundedness and spaciousness. But people also talk about it as a kind of like I think in the Theta model there would be a kind of like I think it's the eighth where you just fully see through yourself, and it's like the bubble of yourself and the world pops,
Mhm.
and then it's
Yep.
like that's I
Yeah,
think
and
there's
then
a
though there are those thresholds, there are those breakthrough moments, some of which are they don't reverse, right?
yeah
They're
yeah
that happens. And yet,
yeah
um, if you imagine you're done, you're probably not. And if you're still breathing, there is work to do.
yeah yeah, and I think the carrying it through into the relative as well is the obviously if you start that side of things, how are you ever going to be done until you've created world peace and ensured that it will never end?
Sure.
Like, I'm sure
Yeah.
there's more suffering to relieve, and yeah,
Yeah, and that's the Mahayana model, right?
right,
Within Buddhism is great. Liberate yourself. Make that a really high priority. Yeah. And then also liberate everyone else. Not
yeah,
that you
and
can,
that
as an agent, intervene in someone else's mind stream and go pop. It doesn't
yeah,
work that way. But
but
do what you can.
those things go together as well, right? Like I think the less reactive you show up in the world, and the lighter, then the better placed you are. Like we spoke about before, if your personal craving, narrative, fixated story comes to a stop, and then you can move forward from a lightness that allows you to act in a way that reduces suffering locally around you and hopefully radiates out. I think
Yeah,
yeah, those two things go well. Whereas I think I think people who are interested in social change who are spirituality phobic or inner work phobic, who see it as kind of self-indulgent or just too much focused on oneself and are more in a kind of self-sacrificial mode, I think those people yeah would assume that it's like that inward focus is somehow counterproductive to the task of showing up in the world
sure.
and helping, because I think they're coming from a kind of fight or flight response instead of a
Hmm.
grounded place. But it feels very clear to me that yeah, that it's a better or it's a more effective perhaps way to relieve suffering rather than seeing from your own fixated perspective, because then you're bringing a lot of you're getting in that's like the bullshit thing I was talking about before of like noticing the way in which one's own unconscious cravings and attachments get in the way of everything really of just like it feels like you're getting in your own way again and again and again without realizing it, and so getting out of
Hmm.
your own way is I guess another way of talking about this path.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
In the most profound way possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and there is this dynamic within Buddhist religious communities, of which I've lived in residentially for long periods of time, and I'm an active member and participant of this tension for practitioners between the project of waking up, like no bullshit, let's get her done, and then the work of social change, institutional reform, advocacy, activism, etc. And people polarize here. So some teachers or practitioners are like, this is the focus on activism and social change and reform or revolution or both. That's a horrible perverted distortion um, of the Buddha's intent and should be stamped out. And then other folks, uh, well, people polarize.
Yeah.
These
And
aren't
I
in
think
conflict in my opinion. These are not in
yeah.
conflict.
And I think that, I mean, maybe it's a too simple analogy to draw, but I think the Theravada and Mahayana differentiation you pointed to before in terms of the Mahayana emphasis on that relative level engagement, um, I think that human instinct of like, yeah, how much to do the relative stuff has been there all along, it seems, or at least going quite far back.
Yeah, I mean, the Mahayana mounted a critique of not just Theravada. Theravada is the only extant like lineage of that kind of
Right.
uh, mm, school of Buddhism, which adheres only to the relatively earliest series of texts and bodies of practices. Um, but yeah, the Mahayana critique was not so much a social critique. Um, actually, I mean, people Just look at if you know your history of how Buddhism spread and functioned in all of these societies, these people were not social revolutionaries.
Right.
They were not attempting to upset the feudal or theocratic or whatever social order by and large. If there are big exceptions, I'm not really aware of them. They were focused on a transcendental aim, like a classically religious soteriological aim,
Right.
within a cosmological context, for putting an end to rebirth and then becoming a cosmic Buddha oneself. And that's the framing, right?
People had simpler aims in
Anyway.
those days.
Yeah, well, different.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if any simpler, but different.
No, joking.
Yeah,
Before we wrap up, is there any topics you want to touch on, or anything any thoughts you want to end on?
yeah, I don't know. I like to drop in here at the end that it is possible for you if you sincerely desire liberation from the sense of a separate identity. That's possible.
Yeah.
I hope this conversation has been useful for folks
Yeah.
to hear.
Yeah, me too. Hope we sucking some of those people into the stream of awakening.
There's they often describe Zen teachers or putting out baited hooks, or there's this phrase in the Tibetan tradition, hooks of compassion.
Maybe that's the episode title. Thanks, Wystan.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.